The Gospel of Matthew would be the natural place to start reading the Bible if you've never done it before, because it's the start of the New Testament. But even though I would encourage you to read every single word of the Bible, maybe Matthew isn't the easiest place to start. You see, the Gospel of Matthew is very heavily tied up with the Old Testament, and is primarily written to the first century Jew, which means that some of this might be a bit confusing if you don't know that much about the Old Testament or about Jewish history. But if you watch this video, I'll try to explain it to you. So this is what you need to know about the Gospel of Matthew. The author of Matthew is, as you may have guessed already, Matthew. At least that is if we trust the church fathers. Nowhere in this book does it say that it is written by Matthew, so technically it is an anonymous book. This has caused some debate in later times about who actually wrote the letter. But since there seemed to be no disagreement about it in the first couple of centuries, I believe that it is pretty safe to say that this was either written by or at least composed by Matthew, one of the 12 apostles of Jesus. It also wouldn't really make sense to credit this book to Matthew in the first place if it wasn't actually written by him. In the Gospels, we learn that he was a tax collector, and tax collectors weren't really that highly regarded people. The book also doesn't say who it is written to, but because there's so much focus on the Jews and the Old Testament, it's pretty safe to assume that it's written to either Jews or Jewish Christians, or at least someone with a Jewish mindset. The Jewish view of the Messiah was pretty different from what Jesus actually turned out to be. The Jewish people had once been a great world power under King David and King Solomon around 1,000 years before Jesus' time. But the power of Israel diminished the more they turned away from God. Around 600 years before Christ, they had been captured by the Babylonians and taken into exile. And even though the Jewish people got to return to their homes after around 50 to 70 years, the Jews were still under someone else's rule and authority. In Jesus' time, the world power was the Romans. So in the Jewish mindset, the Savior that would come would not take away the sins of the world so that we could come to heaven. The Jews were expecting a king to come in the line of David that would free them from the Roman authorities and re-establish Israel as a great nation again, like in the days of David. Something else that happened when the Babylonians captured Israel was that they also destroyed the temple. The temple was believed to be the place where the Spirit of God was, so when the temple was destroyed, God also left. They did make a new temple when they returned and rebuilt Jerusalem, but there's no record of God actually returning to the temple in a similar way that he had been there before. So part of what the Jews were expecting the Messiah to do was to lead the people into holiness, that is, lead people into obeying the law, so that God would return again. That kind of makes sense because the reason why God left in the first place was because they turned away from him and turned to other gods. We think that the reason why Jesus came was to deal with the problem of sin. But in Jewish mindset, they already had a solution to that problem. They had the sacrificial system. If someone sinned, they just sacrificed an animal that would atone for their sins. They did not know that the sacrifice of animals were not enough and that they needed a greater sacrifice. So the Messiah was to come and to re-establish Israel as a great nation and then lead the people into holiness so that God would return. They did not expect God to return in the form of a man and then die on a cross for the sins of the world. So what Matthew is trying to do with this gospel is to try to convince the Jews that even though Jesus didn't come and do what they expected the Messiah to do, he is still the Messiah, and he still fulfills all the prophecies that the Old Testament said about the Messiah. To not be super confused when you read this book, or any of the New Testament books really, it can be helpful to know a little bit about the different Jewish groups. The group that gets the most hate by far in this book is the Pharisees. This was a Jewish sect that saw it as their mission to preserve the law from violations and to keep the holy people pure. They probably started shortly after the Babylonian exile, and they developed an oral law that expanded on the law from the Old Testament to keep people from breaking the actual law. And they made more and more of these laws, and eventually these laws became as important, if not even more important, than the actual law. An example of one of these laws is that you couldn't draw your chair out on a Sabbath, because then you would plow the dust on the ground, and plowing is work, and you couldn't work on a Sabbath. The Pharisees were a social group, not a profession. So these are not professional religious people, they're just someone very passionate about their religion. The next group is the Sadducees, which is also a Jewish sect. They were in some ways connected to the priests, and it's believed that the high priest and his family was a part of this group. This group was not as big as the Pharisees, but because of their priestly connection, they still had a lot of religious and political power. The Sadducees didn't believe in the oral law of the Pharisees, so there was some tension between the groups. They also did not believe in the resurrection from the dead. Originally, the job of the scribes was just to write and copy stuff. But after the return from Babylon, they got the job of copying and interpreting the law. Therefore, they also had some religious power. If I've understood it correctly, the scribes is just a job, not really a sect. And they would hang out around Pharisees often. The Herodians is not really a religious group, more than a political group. They were Jews that were just sucking up to the family of King Herod, hoping to promote the interest of the Jews. The whole book of Matthew is about describing Jesus as the king that was promised, and describing the kingdom that he was bringing. It all starts with this long genealogy that links Jesus back to Abraham, the father of the Jews. But most importantly, it links Jesus to David. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, God gives a promise to David that one of his descendants will sit on the throne in Jerusalem forever. And if you look at the list in Matthew chapter 1, you can see that all the names from David to the deportation to Babylon is the names of the kings of the Jews, which places Jesus into this line that the coming king had to be in. So the point that Matthew is making is that Jesus fits as the king that was promised in the Old Testament. This will happen so many times in this book. Matthew will write, "This happened to fulfill what was written by this prophet." And it's all to make the argument that Jesus is the one that was promised in the Jewish scriptures. The main section of this book is made up of 5 sermons that will describe the kingdom that Jesus is bringing. The Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5 to 7, the sermon of encouragement that Jesus gives to his disciples as he sends them out to proclaim his kingdom in chapter 10, parables of the kingdom in chapter 13, more talk about his kingdom and the nature of his kingdom in chapter 18 to 20, and a sermon on the coming kingdom and end time stuff in chapter 24 and 25. They all have something to do with the kingdom, but they're all different from each other in some ways. The Sermon on the Mount is how Jesus connects his message to the message of the Old Testament, at the same time as he shows how the message of the Old Testament is supposed to be understood. And it shows how the people who have made Jesus king is supposed to live. In short, what God really wants from his people and how he wants his kingdom to be like is a humble people that loves God and wants to do his will. Chapter 10 is about how Jesus sends out his disciples to share that the kingdom of heaven is near. His message is pretty simple. It won't be easy, but don't be afraid because God is with you. Chapter 13 and the parables about the kingdom is describing the kingdom. We have to understand when he's talking about the kingdom, he's not talking about sometime in the future after you die. He's talking about a kingdom on earth that consists of people that wants to give the authority of their lives to Jesus. The kingdom is described as a mustard seed. Even though it seems small and insignificant, it will grow and become something massive, like a mustard tree. Chapter 18 through 20 is about how you have to be humble as a child to inherit the kingdom. And chapter 24 and 25 is about the coming kingdom, that even though it is here now, it's still not yet fully revealed. And he talks about what will happen before he comes. This might be the most confusing sermon that Jesus has, because some of the things that he says is going to happen before he comes already happened in year 70 AD when the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem. If you find this section hard, don't worry too much about it. The main point is to stay faithful to Jesus and keep him as king. If Jesus is the king of your life, you have nothing to worry about when the day comes. The other sections in between these sermons are all about showing how Jesus is the Messiah. He goes and heals a bunch of people, he shows that he has authority over the Sabbath, and he shows that he has more authority than the Pharisees and the scribes. One of the most important sections of this book is when Jesus brings 3 of his closest disciples, Peter, John, and James, up to a high mountaintop. There Moses and Elijah appears to them before a voice from heaven says about Jesus that, "This is my son of whom I am well pleased." listened to him. Then Moses and Elijah are gone, and Jesus is left alone with his disciples. Why Moses and Elijah? Because Moses represents the law and Elijah represents the prophets, and together they represent the whole Old Testament. Jesus is greater than Moses and Elijah, and what he said has more authority than what was written in the Old Testament. The book ends with the last days of Jesus before he was crucified. How he was betrayed of one of his own, how he was on trial before the Jewish council, how he was on trial before the Roman authorities, and how he was crucified. Crucifixion was the most humiliating way to die, and it would usually take 2 to 3 days before you would actually die, sometimes even longer. This was especially the punishment for criminal slaves. But even though it is a humiliating way to die, in Matthew it is not really depicted as the failure of Jesus at all. It is depicted as a great event. He gets a scarlet robe, he gets a crown of thorns, and he gets an inscription above his head that says, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." And when he died, the curtain in the temple ripped. Dead people walked in the streets, and the centurion cried out that surely this was the Son of God. Jesus did not fail by dying on that cross. Rather, it was the crowning of him as king. Jesus didn't stay dead for too long, and he rose from the grave and he appeared to his disciples. Notice what isn't in this chapter. It ends by the Great Commission. All authority in heaven and on earth is given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded, and behold, I am with you always, to the end of the age. Matthew ends with Jesus' promise to be with his disciples, but he leaves out the fact that Jesus left just a few days after he was ascended into heaven. And I don't think that it was because Matthew wanted to hide the fact that Jesus wasn't walking around on earth anymore. I think that was a well-known fact on this point. It's rather that Matthew wants to leave his audience with the fact that Jesus is with them forever, and he is king forever. Just because Jesus is not with us like physically today doesn't mean he's not here. Jesus is king forever, even today, and Jesus is still here. To end with, I just want to ask you some questions that we can take out from what Matthew is trying to teach us. Because if we don't let the Bible transform us, we're just filling our heads with empty knowledge. Application is the goal of Bible study. I think the one thing that sticks out in this book is that Jesus is king, and his kingdom is here and now. This should leave us asking the questions. Is Jesus the king of your life? Is there any area of your life where Jesus is not king? And when you pray, may your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, has it occurred to you that that might require change in your own life? You can do whatever you want with these questions, but I would encourage you to do something practical about it. Write something in the comments of how Jesus has changed your life, or send someone a message of encouragement. Or if it's sin that you haven't dealt with yet, tell a friend and leave it behind you. Live out your new life in Jesus. Anyway, I hope you learned something. If not, that's fine. I'm not pretending to be an expert. I don't pretend like I know everything about this book. And there's so much more we could talk about. But for now, that was the Gospel according to Matthew, and I'll see you in the next video.